Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. We've seen plenty of teams make roster changes after a game before. You're never going to see a team start the season with the exact same roster that they finish it with. Guys get cut after games because of poor play, or because someone is coming back from an injury and their services are no longer needed and they need a free roster spot, or because it just wasn't working out in some capacity. Nothing about that is particularly surprising or newsworthy. Cutting one player or even a few players and making those roster changes after a game is a normal part of the cutthroat business that is the National Football League. But imagine after a game, a coach cutting his entire team. Seriously. Imagine a coach deciding that he was going to release every single player that played for him and just start from scratch. Something like that seems ridiculous, and seems almost impossible when you consider the logistics that would come from the aftermath of it. However, as ridiculous as it sounds, in 1966, that's exactly what Washington head coach Otto Graham tried to do. Following a game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, he was close to cutting literally every single player on his team. And this is the story behind what has to be the craziest coaching moment in the long history of that franchise. Before I talk about the moment, we need some context to understand just who Otto Graham is, how his team was playing, and how the game went where Graham would even consider doing something so ridiculous, and let's just be blunt here, something so stupid. Today, most people remember Graham as being one of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of professional football, and rightfully so. I don't think there's a single person that has a bad thing to say about him as a quarterback. In many ways, he was a trailblazer who revolutionized the way the game was played on the offensive side of the ball, and he is undoubtedly the greatest quarterback in the history of the Browns franchise. Heck, with the exception of Jim Brown, many would consider Graham to be the greatest player to ever wear a Browns uniform. In his 10 seasons with the team, he led the league, whether it was the NFL or the AAFC, in passing yards 5 times. He led the league in passer rating 5 times. He had a winning record every single season, winning 4 AAFC titles in 4 years from 1946 to 49, and then winning the NFL championship 3 times after the merger, going 57-13-1 in that stretch. In all 10 years that Graham was in Cleveland, he played in his league's championship game all 10 times. Graham once said about his time with the Browns, when Paul Brown talked contract, the championship game was part of it. We took the championship game for granted, and Graham's play was a big reason why. As a side note, to learn more about Graham and those Browns teams of the 1950s, click the card in the upper right corner. After retirement, Graham was the head coach for the Coast Guard Academy for 7 years, and in 1963, went as far as guiding the Coast Guard to a perfect regular season and an appearance in the Tangerine Bowl. Guiding the Coast Guard to a bowl game, especially when there were only 9 bowl games back then, was no small feat. And in 1966, Graham was hired to be the head coach of an NFL team. After 5 seasons with Bill McPeak in charge, where Washington finished below 500 all 5 times, it was time for a change, with Otto Graham being named the new man in charge. This was his first ever coaching job in the professional ranks, and now, the legendary Hall of Fame quarterback who had built an incredible legacy with Cleveland was looking to build a new legacy on the sidelines with a different team. Unfortunately, it didn't look like it was going to go that way at first. Remember how Graham said that he took the NFL championship for granted in Cleveland? It was looking incredibly unlikely that he was going to be able to do the same in Washington. Not that I think anyone had any expectations for Washington heading into the 1966 campaign, especially since this was going to be, statistically speaking, the hardest season in the history of the NFL to make it to the postseason, with 8 teams in the East fighting for 1 spot since the Atlanta Falcons joined as an expansion team, and since the league was still in a 2-division system. But any expectations that people had were quickly dashed after the first 2 weeks of the season, where Washington looked like they did not belong on the same field as their opponent. In Week 1 against the Cleveland Browns, they got embarrassed 38-14. After Washington scored the first 2 touchdowns of the game, with both coming from eventual Hall of Fame receiver Charlie Taylor, Cleveland scored 38 unanswered to close it off, including 21 in the 4th quarter alone. Washington turned it over 6 times, and their pass defense was atrocious, as Browns quarterback Frank Ryan threw for 3 touchdowns and no picks, while posting a pass rating of 111.5, which is a great rating by today's standards, and is an absurdly high rating for 1966 standards. In Week 2 against the St. Louis Cardinals, they lost by 3 possessions, falling 23-7. Remember that 16 points was a 3-possession game back then in 1966, as a 2-point conversion did not exist in the NFL. Once again, Washington failed to score a point in the second half, and once again, they collapsed defensively in the 4th quarter, with the Cardinals scoring 17 unanswered in the final period of play. Washington also turned it over 3 times and picked up 27 rushing yards on 20 carries, coming out to a mere 1.35 yards per carry. Through the first 2 weeks, Washington was 0-2. Their 61 points allowed was the 2nd most in football, only ahead of the New York Giants, who would have a historically bad defense that year and allowed 86 points for their first 2 games. Their 21 points scored was the worst total in their division, and their point differential of -40 was the second worst in all of football, only ahead of the New York Giants at -45. Again, no one thought that Washington was going to do anything of note this year, but if they had any shot at winning the division, they could not afford to slip up and fall to 0-3. Their season was in grave danger of being over before the end of September. Up next was a game on the road against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And as we were about to find out, things were about to get crazy. September 25th, 1966. We're at Pitt Stadium for this Eastern matchup between Washington and Pittsburgh. If Pittsburgh won, they'd be undefeated after 3 weeks for the first time since 1963. As for Washington, a loss would drop them to 0-3, would start the Otto Graham era off on the worst foot possible, and would give them their third straight season with an 0-3 record after 3 weeks. And sure enough, this game was looking like a disaster early on for Graham and company. Even though Washington jumped out to a 9-0 lead in the first quarter, the Steelers came climbing back, and quickly worked themselves out of the deficit. After Ron Smith hit Gary Ballman on a 49-yard touchdown, and Jim Bradshaw intercepted Sonny Jurgensen on a 27-yard pick six, Pittsburgh was going into the halftime break with a 14-9 lead. As a side note, to learn more about the career of Gary Ballman, click the card in the upper right corner. Speaking of Ballman, who was one of the best receivers in football at this point, he struck again for the second time today coming out of the halftime break, as after a 79-yard pass from Smith, the Steelers had a 21-9 lead. Things were looking bleak for Washington, who were down by 2 possessions, had no answers for Pittsburgh's offense, had not found the end zone yet, and had not scored a single point all season in the second half. Fortunately for them, this was the game where they finally turned on the Jets. The wheels were spinning in motion, and in the second half after that point, Washington played some of the best football that they had played in a long time. At minimum, it was their best football of the short Otto Graham era thus far. A 4-yard touchdown by Charlie Taylor made it 21-16. Later in the third quarter, a 35-yard touchdown by Bobby Mitchell made it 24-23. Taylor worked his magic again when he ran into from 2 yards out near the end of the quarter to give Washington its first lead of the second half, as they now led it 30-24. And after the teams exchanged field goals during the fourth quarter, Washington was leaving Pitt Stadium with an incredible come-from-behind 33-27 victory. Washington had scored 21 points all season. They matched that total in the third quarter of this game alone. It was a great second-half performance and a heck of a comeback. But after the game, what should have been a joyous occasion, with the team getting their first win of the season and Graham getting his first win as an NFL head coach, was anything but that. Because Otto Graham was ready to cut his entire team. After the game, Graham was interviewed, and was being interviewed live on national television in a post-game press conference. He knew that the cameras were on him, and he knew that there were no offhand comments to be made. This was live television at its finest. When one reporter asked Graham what he would have done if his team didn't come back, Graham responded pretty bluntly by saying, "I would have fired them all." Naturally, this comment drew a few laughs, because something like this is usually said in a joking context. But Graham quickly silenced the reporters in the room by following that up by saying, "Do you think I'm kidding?" At this point, everyone realized that Graham was serious and he actually would have fired his entire team. Now you might be thinking to yourself that this might just be an attempt at deadpan humor, that this was all an exaggeration, and that he wasn't really going to fire every single one of his players. This is blowing the entire story and one single comment way out of proportion, in the same way that John McKay wasn't actually going to execute his team, or Brian Kelly wasn't actually going to execute his team. However, unlike McKay or Kelly, where you clearly knew that they were joking, or in Kelly's case, trying to make a joke, there's a few reasons to believe that Graham was being completely serious. Number one, Graham had complete control over the roster. Along with being the head coach, he was the general manager. Every player that Washington signed or released, and every decision involving roster management that Washington made, Graham was responsible for. And what's that old saying about never joking about someone's employment status if you're the one that has power over them? Number two, Graham continued in the press conference after that statement about how poorly Washington played, and never said anything positive about his team. He was furious that they played so sloppily against the Steelers, and was furious at how the season was going. Graham said, "We made more mistakes today than we did when we lost our first 2 games. I just can't count all the mistakes that we made." One report went as far as saying that you would never think after the game that Washington won it based off of Graham's demeanor. But the biggest piece of evidence in favor of Graham being completely serious about firing his entire team? Maybe it's the fact that 1 year later, he legitimately tried to do this after a loss. Anyone who believed that Graham was joking about this comment has to look to what happened at the end of the 1967 season 1 year later. To close out that season, Washington took on the New Orleans Saints at home, an expansion team widely regarded as one of the worst in football. And the Saints won 30-14, which meant that Washington finished the season with a losing record and a 3-possession loss to a team that hadn't played a game until 3 months ago. Graham responded by holding a press conference where he announced that literally his entire team was on the trading block. He wanted to get rid of them all. Didn't matter how long they had been there or how good they were, with even guys like Charlie Taylor, Bobby Mitchell, and Sonny Jurgensen being available. As Graham said quite bluntly, every player we have is available. We need help right across the board. So even though Graham sounded like he was joking when he made that comment against the Steelers in 1966, or maybe sounded like he was joking, considering the follow-up where he bashed his guys, considering his demeanor, considering the control that he had over the roster and how he exerted that control, and considering the fact that 1 year later, he legitimately tried to do this and get rid of his entire team, he was not joking. He was being completely 100% serious. Had Washington not come back, he was going to fire his entire team and cut every single player that the team had. As for how the logistics behind that would have worked, I'm not entirely sure, because good luck trying to fill literally an entire NFL roster in 1 week. But Graham was dead set on finding a way to make that happen before the comeback took place. As you can probably guess, the Otto Graham era in Washington was not a good one. Washington never had a winning record in his 3 seasons in charge, with the team getting worse every single year. And you can imagine just how much of a breath of fresh air it was in 1969 when the team got Vince Lombardi out of retirement to coach the team. To learn more about that season and how Lombardi came to Washington, click the card in the upper right corner. But in some ways, it was kind of impressive that Graham lasted 3 seasons in the nation's capital, because he was moments away from not having a team to coach at all. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 PM Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9, and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.